Let's go live to Washington now. That's where we find the Shadow Foreign Minister Simon Birmingham, who's been taking part in the American-Australian Leadership Dialogue. Thanks so much for your time, Minister. Appreciate it. First of all, let's get to the dialogue because it comes at a time where we've signed AUKUS. The relationship with the United States is super important. What have you picked up during this forum? Is there more of a pivot to the Pacific than we've seen ever before?
Hi, Laura, and thanks for the opportunity. Look, this has been a very important opportunity, the Australian-American Leadership Dialogue, for both sides of politics in Australia, together with both sides of politics in the United States, along with officials, academics, business leaders and others, to engage. And it's been a real demonstration of the broad extent of bipartisan cooperation in relation to many of the strategic challenges that Australia and the United States and the world faces, the challenges that have been exemplified by the more authoritarian stances taken by nations around the world, and particularly, of course, by the very abrupt actions of Russia with its invasion into Ukraine and the terrible humanitarian toll that's taken, but equally the unifying aspect that has had amongst countries of Europe, amongst the P4 who participated in the NATO summit, and with all of those aspects then looking at strategically how Australia and the US, with our deep, long-lasting alliance, work together to realise the ambitions of AUKUS, not just in the delivery as quickly as possible of the nuclear-powered submarines, but also the other important aspects of our alliance, the cooperation for Australia to establish a sovereign guided weapons missile facility within Australia, the importance of our work together on other areas of technology and artificial intelligence and elsewhere. These are all crucial aspects and for which there is a strong level of commitment from both sides of politics in Australia, as there is here in the US.
Yeah, indeed. And whilst you're in Washington, we've also heard from Scott Morrison, who's been in Seoul. He has been really bolshy, you might say. His comments about China, and particularly in relation to Russia, he's essentially accused China of spurring on the war crimes perpetrated by Vladimir Putin. Do you agree with him?
Certainly China's actions, or more to the point, inactions in a number of cases, have provided a certain tacit acknowledgement pathway for Russia. It would have been far preferable for China to strongly condemn and join the rest of the world in strongly condemning Russia's actions. The fact that China also does appear to have filled a void created by some of the economic sanctions that much of the rest of the world have imposed upon Russia by picking up demand for Russian wheat and the like, has not only been a failure to participate in those sanctions, but has been an undermining of elements of those sanctions. And all of that has occurred at the same time as Russia has been engaging in this horrific invasion of Ukraine, the terrible loss of life, the loss of civilian life, the committing of what do appear to be war crimes by Russia through their actions that are occurring there. And I would once again, as I have before, as the previous government did, and as indeed the current government does, urge Russia to take a stronger stance when it comes to Russia's actions, urge China to show leadership in that regard and to do what they can to apply influence over Russia to cease and desist from these terrible activities.
This is Scott Morrison's first foray onto the world stage since the election defeat. What does this say about what kind of role that he will play post-politics?
Well, Scott Morrison has kept a low profile since the election defeat. This is him giving his first speech. There was always going to be a first speech, and I guess there was always going to be interest in a first speech. I'm not sure there's too much more I can add to what it will say about the future. It will be up to him as to how he chooses to conduct himself as the member for Cook, still a member of the Australian Parliament, but also in that distinguished place as a former Prime Minister. I think most people would acknowledge, and I think Scott himself acknowledges, that there's a role for former Prime Ministers in constructive engagement, in indeed talking about their legacy and contributions and sharing some of the insights that they have. But I think Scott also appreciates that role is best done in a careful way and not in any way undermining the day-to-day politics and governing of the country. And I'm sure he will be mindful of that.
The Pacific Islands Forum has just concluded. We see Anthony Albanese on the world stage well and truly now. It was interesting at this forum, on display, not only was Anthony Albanese saying it, but it seemed that there was a better relationship with the Labor leader than there was with Scott Morrison. Do you acknowledge that?
Look, I think it's hard to say that, and no, I don't necessarily acknowledge that. Let's remember that after the 2019 election, the very first overseas trip that Scott Morrison took was a bilateral visit to the Solomon Islands, that he always gave priority to participation in Pacific Island Forum matters. And the step up in the Pacific has been very significant. One of the things I strongly welcome and was good to be able to talk about it here in Washington this week was the announcement by the United States during the Pacific Islands Forum that they are doing as Australia has done in recent years, and that is expanding the diplomatic presence in the Pacific Island nations. We in government in recent years opened 6 new diplomatic missions, embassies and high commissions across the Pacific Island countries, and it's fabulous to now see the United States following suit and expanding their diplomatic presence. It was good to see that they also had US naval vessel providing medical support and assistance in the Pacific Islands while the PIF was happening. This again is complementary to the types of actions that Australia has. I warmly welcome the fact that Anthony Albanese was at the PIF, as he should be, as Australia's leader. It's important whoever it is there and that they seek to strike those relations. But I think he is actually building off of a relatively strong platform. Of course, the new government stance in relation to climate change adds to that platform from the position of a number of those Pacific nations, and that's something I recognise too.
One final question. Anthony Albanese facing his big first COVID test, I would say, the third wave. We also have calls from premiers, which you will be familiar with, namely Anastasia Palaszczuk, wanting to extend some of these payments that you put an end date on. There's a lesson here, isn't there? There's a level of bipartisanship. Do you offer that bipartisanship to Anthony Albanese, who's so far stood firm against his own side?
Laura, firstly, let me invite your listeners to think about what Anthony Albanese, Mark Butler and the Labor Party would have been saying if the positions were reversed 3 months ago. They would have been saying that the government was failing to take action. They would have been saying that there should be support for vulnerable Australians, for senior Australians and others. They would have been critical of Scott Morrison and all aspects of our government. They would have done so in a hyper-partisan way. So let's acknowledge that that's the way they behave every time any type of support came to an end. We as a government routinely reviewed the timelines for the ending of support, and at the time we took health advice and medical advice as well as financial advice to consider the best possible pathway forward for the nation. It's for this government to now step forward and be clear and transparent with the Australian people. What medical advice have they received? Are they acting consistent with that medical advice? Did they have consultations with the states and territories before locking into the position that they're taking? These are all matters now for the government to do. As a former finance minister, I strongly acknowledge the fact that that temporary supports should remain temporary and should come off. But the previous opposition, as they then were, and now government, were always fairly quick to criticise, always very quick to argue that these supports should continue. And now they need to make sure that they hold themselves to the type of standard they used to hold the previous government to.
It sounds like you're tempted to engage in a little bit of payback. Is that right?
Laura, I just think they need to, as I said, hold themselves to the same type of standard that they held the previous government to. And that includes being transparent about what the medical advice is. There's no doubt the current COVID situation in Australia is relatively serious to the extent of the number of cases, the concurrence of it with the flu season. And so they need to be clear about what the health and medical advice is and the consequences from that advice of the decisions they've taken to not extend these payments or to not extend the availability of RATs, of which, again, if you recall, pre-election, they were promising free RATs for everybody.
Yeah.
Now they're refusing to even extend a program that was only targeted to pensioners and income support recipients.
Yes, I do recall. Simon Birmingham, live from Washington. Appreciate your time.
Thanks, Laura. My pleasure.